Good morning, John Cooper School. I have been asked to introduce our Black History Month speaker, Coach Matthew Wilson. As some of you may know, Matthew graduated from Cooper in 2006. What you may not know is that he went on to earn his bachelor's degree in business administration from the American University in Washington, D.C., followed by his MBA at Rice, and most recently, receiving his master's in education from Baylor University. Throughout all his academic endeavors and achievements, there has been one very important theme: basketball, which is kind of what brings me here today. I have known Coach Wilson and his twin brother Chad for 26 years. They were two of my son's best friends and classmates at David Elementary. And for almost half of those years, they were teammates. I spent countless hours in the bleachers cheering those boys on from the YMCA and WCBL, the Austin Gym in 7th and 8th grade, and to the opening of the Dunlap Gym their freshman year. I have traveled to almost every gym in the Houston area and as far as Disney World to see them compete in AAU tournaments. In the 23 years that I have been at Cooper, that group of boys made up the best team this school has seen, not only winning SPC their senior year, but outscoring several public school teams along the way. Since leaving Cooper, Coach Wilson has never left the basketball court. He was named captain of his American team his senior year, and while studying at Rice, he became an assistant coach at Episcopal High School. At Baylor, he was a graduate assistant coach for the men's team, going on to the Sweet 16 in 2014. His road back to Cooper took him through coaching positions at New Mexico State University and Kilgore College. Before I hand you off to our speaker today, I want to add a few more accolades that I was a spectator of in Matthew's early years. Matthew has always been a natural-born leader, but never one to let his own success get in the way of his team's accomplishments. He was an honor student, a Habitat service chair, and a friend to all. I am extremely proud of the man he is today and hope you will join me in welcoming Coach Matthew Wilson as today's Black History Month speaker.
Hey guys, Coach Wilson here. I am thrilled to be with you guys. I want to thank Mrs. Lawrence for introducing me. If you guys, I'm sure you guys could glean, but Mrs. Lawrence is somebody that I care tremendously about. I have known her and she has known me since I was 8 years old. One of her sons is one of my best friends growing up. And so I'm thrilled that we've got the lifelong friendship that we do. I appreciate all of your kind words, Mrs. Lawrence. I'd also like to extend a thanks to Mrs. Crane, Mrs. Inman, Mr. Pop, and Mr. Williams for the opportunity to share my thoughts with you guys. You know, these are a culmination of some of my thoughts, my feelings, some of the experiences that I've had and throughout my family that I'm sharing with you guys. My hope is that it resonates with some of you and that it challenges you and inspires you to maybe dig a little bit deeper as you guys learn through Black History Month and about some of the heroes in the civil rights movement and throughout Black history in the United States. And so, with further ado, I'd like to share some of my thoughts. I remember as a student, Black History Month was always something that was kind of uncomfortable for me. Growing up, through David Elementary, through Cooper, I was almost always one of, maybe just myself or one of two Black students in a classroom. And so I felt like during Black History Month, it was all eyes on me, and everybody, was just kind of staring at me. And I felt like I was put in a position to where I had to speak for all of Black America, just myself. And I think all of you could understand and identify with the feeling of being singled out or being the only one asked to speak in the room. And it can be uncomfortable. And, as a student growing up, I was. Now in hindsight, with retrospect and, looking back, I understand that my classmates weren't wanting to single me out. They didn't want me to feel uncomfortable. They were curious. They understood that maybe my experience was a little bit different from theirs, and it was. And they genuinely, out of a place of care and concern, they wanted to know, how I felt about certain things. And So now, with hindsight, I'm excited to share with you guys some of my thoughts. One of the things I would like to say is I wasn't always just uncomfortable with Black History Month. There were some things that I loved about it. One of the things that I loved the most was just learning about the stories of people that I look up to as heroes. People like Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, Thurgood Marshall, Muhammad Ali, Harriet Tubman, Jackie Robinson, the recently passed House Representative John Lewis. All of these people are people that I look up to. They're people that are heroes of mine. They're people that defied insurmountable odds, and bravely they faced danger, faced actual like danger to their health and well-being, and threats to their family, to accomplish the things that they did. And so, for me, learning about those stories was always very inspiring. It was something that made me feel connected, and it was something that I really enjoyed. One of the things that over time I've kind of felt throughout Black History Month is that I think we do a great job of highlighting some of the key people and the key movers and shakers within the civil rights movement, and some of the groundbreakers and glass ceiling shatterers throughout Black history. I think the one thing that sometimes we we gloss over, is that you know the insurmountable odds weren't just these fictional things. A lot of times we talk about the heroism of somebody, and we gloss over what the challenges that they faced. We gloss over why were those odds insurmountable, and that's one of the things that I'd encourage you guys. I'd love for you guys to dig deeper with, to look into. And with that, I'd like to share one of my own personal stories. It's a hero of mine. It's my grandfather, because he faced some tremendous odds throughout his lifetime. His goal was to try to secure as best as he could a safe and prosperous livelihood for his children and his children's children. And I kind of want you guys to understand some of the actual policy difficulties that he faced. And so he was a World War II veteran. He was, after the war, he was a mechanic and a handyman. He was a mechanical engineer in the Army, but obviously an incredibly hard worker, very, very intelligent person. And like many World War II vets, he came back to the United States, changed. He came back to a new economy in the United States. And one of the things that really propelled the economy after World War II was a bill called the GI Bill. The history of the GI Bill was created in 1944, prior to the end of World War II, to help veterans as they returned assimilate back to society and give them a chance to be successful in new economies and different industries. After World War II, there was a huge influx of veterans that returned to the United States, and they struggled. There wasn't an infrastructure put in place, or at least there was a very minimal infrastructure put in place to support the veterans after World War I. And so a lot of them struggled financially, a lot of them struggled with health issues. And so during World War II, President FDR wanted to make sure that the veterans of World War II had a fallback. They had support. They had resources so that they could propel their families, forward and not struggle. After possibly giving the ultimate sacrifice and returning home. And so the GI Bill, what it did was it provided very, very low interest loans, and sometimes grants for home ownership. It also provided very low interest loans and some scholarships for education, so for college, for veterans. And so what it allowed them to do was, one, have a home, have a place where they could call home that was safe, that was nice, that could be a long-term asset for them, that was very, very affordable. And the second thing that it allowed them to do was gain access into industries that perhaps they couldn't work in prior to the war. They would be able to get, the degrees and the certifications, whatever was necessary for them to gain entry into prosperous professions, professions where they could excel, they could continue to pay off their house, to build equity into their homes. For those of you that don't know, home ownership in the United States has long been kind of one of the foundational bedrocks of generational prosperity, of generational asset moving. And so it's kind of been the bedrock for people to build stable, not just finances for themselves, but stable finances for their families later on. A home is an asset to where typically it gets passed on to other family members, or if it gets sold, the cash that's returned from the sale gets passed on to other family members where they can then invest. They can invest in their own education. They can invest in property. They can invest in different market assets to where a home that was owned in the family 60 years ago could, throughout time, if invested well, that asset can be worth, tenfold, 20-fold, 100-fold, 50, 60, 70 years down the line, depending on how it was invested. And so home ownership for a lot of Americans has been a key driver in economic success. A lot of people have been able to start businesses through taking out second mortgages on their homes, and build very, very successful companies. A lot of people that are entrepreneurs today started with a small investment from a parent that was obtained through, equity in their house. And so it's a huge driver of economic activity dating back for, hundreds of years is home ownership. Well, the promise of the GI Bill was one that it was supposed to guarantee those benefits to all veterans, and it was written in such a way that all veterans were eligible. Part of the history of the United States is granting rights to all humans, to all citizens of the United States. But then on the local level, the state level, a lot of times those rights have been denied to people of color. And that right, the GI Bill, some of the promises of the GI Bill were denied to my grandfather. After World War II, there was an explosion in the suburbs, an absolute explosion. There were homes being built left and right. There were communities popping up left and right, brand new, nice homes. A lot of them were then owned by veterans because they could afford them. They could afford to move out of the city in a cramped apartment, buy a house with a yard and a fence, and have a property that would gain in value. For African Americans, unfortunately, the vast majority of suburbs that were built directly after World War II did not allow people of color to move there through charter, through threats of violence. People of color were not allowed to buy a home there. It was actually literally written into charters of some of a lot of the first suburbs, like planned communities. The Woodlands didn't exist back then, but the Woodlands is kind of, the model of the Woodlands is kind of based on some of those initial planned communities in the suburbs. And so that promise wasn't available to my grandfather and many other hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of other Black veterans. Further, even if it wasn't written directly into the charter of a lot of those communities, banks would not loan to people of color if they wanted to buy a house in that area. They might loan at a higher interest rate to an area in the city, but they would not loan to an area that they deemed was a high prosperity area. And so that promise, wasn't met to my grandfather. Just like the promise of the education. At that time, a lot of colleges were still segregated. A lot of colleges did not allow people of color to attend. And so there are a lot of programs for which he could have qualified for as a mechanical engineer that he then could not. And so he was not able to gain the certifications. He was not able to obtain the degree that he did, or that he would have qualified for, to allow him to earn more money as a gainfully employed adult. And so he became a handyman, like I mentioned, and he worked incredibly hard. And he was hopeful. He was a very prideful person who worked very hard, but he was also hopeful that the conditions that prevented him from going to college and prevented him from owning a home in a nice area, that those conditions would be removed by the time his children and possibly his grandchildren um, were alive and able to fend for themselves. But those policies impacted my family. It impacted my parents. My parents did not have the means to go to college on their own, and so both of my parents, they started out after high school working and going to college, taking night classes little by little to try to eventually earn their degree. My mother ended up getting an associate's degree. My father ended up getting several certifications that allowed him to work. But the ability to have a parent just pay for their college education wasn't one that they had. And both my grandparents were entrepreneurs. My father's father was a barber, and my mother's father was a handyman who owned his own shop. But neither one of them were able to accrue enough income to provide a boost for their kids the way that they would have liked, and the way that they would have been able to had the promises of the GI Bill been extended to all. And so what that instilled in my parents, both of them, was a work ethic and a drive to then provide for me what their parents couldn't provide for them. And largely they have done that. They provided me with a home in a very nice area, against the odds for them. They were able to provide for me a private school education, again against the odds. My father is a man who, like I said, didn't have a 4-year college degree. He's worked in the technology industry for now almost 40 years. Now, I think it's important to recognize that there are odds breakers. Both of my parents are odds breakers. There are people that can escape constructs and policies that are designed to restrict them financially, and they're designed to restrict opportunities. Those restrictions are designed to bottle up more than they allow through. It's like the bottleneck effect. And so there will be some people like my parents that, through hard work, through intelligence, through ingenuity, through a little bit of luck, being in the right place at the right time and seizing an opportunity, were able to propel themselves forward. But the vast majority of people that were black, that looked like me at those times, weren't able to escape all of those odds. The other thing that goes hand in hand with with property values and the ability to own a home in a nice area is education. The education system is funded by property taxes, which means if you live in a nicer area, the home values are higher, the property taxes are higher, which means the schools are funded better. You're able to have a better education. Well, if you're in an area, or you weren't initially allowed to live in an area where property values are high, your education is going to be worse. If you have a worse education, you're going to be less prepared for high-level jobs going forward. And so it can be this repeating cycle that traps people. And so for me, both of my parents are people that I look up to as heroes, because they are both odds breakers. They are both people that found a way to escape. And like I said, some was through a little bit of luck, some was through ingenuity, but not everybody is able to, and not everybody that is capable or hardworking is able to escape some of those policies. And so, I think that's just one example of how a policy can change the trajectory of a family. Imagine had my grandfather lived in a nice area, had property values, been able to invest in my parents, in maybe their entrepreneurial ventures, their college pursuits, been able to have a career as a mechanical engineer with a very, very solid income for, the next 40 years of his life. Imagine where financially my family would have started. Whereas now, my parents will be the first ones passing on a house, to our generation. I've just now purchased my first house. This is actually the room that I'm in right now. It's empty because I'm expecting a child in May. It'll be my first son with my wife, and so that this will eventually be our nursery. But this is our first house that we just purchased just a few months ago. And so imagine had we had the resources to have had this purchase 15 years ago, or for our parents to help us buy a house, to where then we can invest this money in financial markets and institutions where our family could have been. And so again, these are the ramifications on one family from one policy. We haven't discussed in depth the education system and the inequalities in the education system. We haven't discussed at all the justice system. We haven't discussed at all the public health system and how in practice, while policies may not be actively discriminatory, in practice they can be. We haven't discussed any of those policies. Well, all of those policies have practices, and they have individual care holders that can negatively impact people of color throughout the courses of the years and increase the odds in which people struggle, people fail, people have financial ruin or health ruin. And so as you learn about these heroes, really, really dig deep. Try to understand, what are the policy, the effects of policy, public policy in the United States that may have had a role in creating the odds that you see some of these heroes in the civil rights movement and beyond have faced. That would be my goal for you. That is kind of the purpose of why I wanted to share my thoughts with you guys, why I wanted to share my family story with you guys. Obviously, in 100 years, there's been a tremendous amount of progress. I don't think that is something that should be understated. At the same time, I do think it's very important to understand the historical impacts of policies that were enacted 60, 70, 80 years ago, how they impact lives today, because they do dramatically. And also understand that every Black person's experience is different. My experience is very, very different from many other Black people, namely because my parents were able to provide an opportunity for me that many people haven't been. Understand that each person's experience is different, but valuable and worthy. With that, I thank you for listening. I thank you for the time. Again, Ms. Crane, Ms. Inman, Mr. Pop, and Mr. Williams, I thank you tremendously for the opportunity to share my thoughts with our students, and have a great rest of the day, rest of the week, rest of the month, and go on and prosper. Take care, guys.